Which Blue Jackets prospect is the most important? We discuss on today's Locked On Blue Jackets.
You're Locked On Blue Jackets, your daily podcast on the Columbus Blue Jackets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, welcome to Locked On Blue Jackets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am, as always, your host, Jay Foster, here to give you the good, the bad, and the ugly about your favorite team and mine, the Columbus Blue Jackets. Before we get things started, I want to thank everyone for making this your first listen of the day every single day. Locked On Blue Jackets is free and available on all podcast platforms and over on YouTube. I also have to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Also, before we get into it, just a quick housekeeping note that I forgot to mention on Monday, which is because I forgot it was happening on Monday. Locked On Blue Jackets and all of the Locked On NHL shows are going down to part-time as of this week because it's the off-season for us. So until about September, it's going to be 3, maybe 4 times a week instead of the usual. So we still got lots of great content coming your way, but we will not have episodes every day. And with that, let's get into today's show. So I wanted to talk about some prospect stuff, and we're going to talk about all kinds of prospect stuff for the rest of this week, I think. I've got a bunch of stuff planned. I want to talk about like the top 25 players on the Blue Jackets that are the top 25 Blue Jackets that are under the age of 25, which I know is something that Habs Eyes on the Prize do for the Habs every year, and it's always a lot of fun. So I thought I would do one of those. That's not today. I also want to talk about the draft that's just come up. I'm going to get a draft expert to come on and talk about the Blue Jackets draft and how it went. But today I want to talk about the most important prospect in the system. And it kind of seems like a slam dunk that the most important prospect is Cayden Lindstrom, right? But I want to kind of bring a couple of other guys into the mix. So we're going to talk about Cayden Lindstrom, who, obviously the hope is that he's going to be that second line center behind Adam Fantilli. But I also want to talk about Jackson Smith, who is hopefully, along with Denton Matejchuk, going to be kind of the backbone of this team in, 5 years' time for the next 10 years after that. And also under the radar, I want to talk about Pyotr Andreyanov. And I also want to talk about a couple of the other goaltending guys as well. So let's get into it. Let's talk about Cayden Lindstrom first, because I think the biggest argument for him is that he is just the most important prospect, right? Like he has most of the pros, I think, that people are looking for. Obviously, Cayden Lindstrom has kind of had an up and down time since being drafted. Obviously, he missed a bunch of time in his draft year with injury. Blue Jackets took him 4th overall anyway. And he then missed every single regular season game in the 25-26 season. Came back for the playoffs, had 2 goals, 2 assists in 4 playoff games, which I believe includes the Memorial Cup, of which they made it to the final, lost to the London Knights, because of course they did, and has now committed to the NCAA with Michigan State University. So I really like this move for Lindstrom, first off. I think moving to the NCAA is a great choice for him. It's fewer games. It's more off-ice work. It's getting in the gym. I think it'll be a lot easier to test his back and see how far he can really push it. They're saying that he's basically 100% now, and so we have no choice but to take them at their word. But I think playing less games at a higher competition is probably going to be a great move for Lindstrom. The reason that I'm arguing that he's the most important prospect is that center depth is the hardest thing to achieve in the NHL, right? And the Blue Jackets have a pretty good go of it right now, knock on wood, right? With Monahan and Fantilli kind of as your 1A, 1B situation right now. I think Monahan's probably going to be the 1C going forward unless, Fantilli continues the rocket-like trajectory that he had last season and makes the Blue Jackets make a tough decision. But Monahan is not going to be there forever, right? He's already 30 years old. He's got 4 years left on his deal, going to be 34 by the end of it. The hope is that Cayden Lindstrom can come in and be the successor to Monahan. So Fantilli moves up to the 1C. Lindstrom moves into that 2C position. I've talked to a couple of people and they say, even if he doesn't turn into that 2C, the option for him to be a top line or top six winger are still extremely high. A line of Lindstrom, Fantilli, Johnson sounds pretty fun to me, but obviously the hope is that he is that second line center that so many teams keep looking for. And the Blue Jacket, honestly, for a long time, all the Blue Jackets had was 3Cs, right? They had a bunch of middle six centers or middle six wingers that were playing top six center minutes. And right now, the Blue Jackets kind of have not a gluttony of centers, but, between Monahan, Fantilli, and then obviously bringing in Coyle, Lundstrom. Jenna can play center if you need him to. I wouldn't, but you've got Cole Sillinger still. Richie Vronkov can ostensibly play center if you need him to, but again, I put him in kind of the Jenna camp of probably shouldn't unless it's a disaster, unless it's break glass in case of emergency type thing. So the Blue Jackets are in a pretty good place with their center position at the minute. Knock on wood again. They've got a handful of prospects waiting in the wings. I think Luca Del Barbaluz is going to be a fine NHL center, but Lindstrom is, you pick him fourth overall. You want him to be a cornerstone piece of the franchise, right? You want him to join that core group that they're building right now of, Fantilli, Marchenko, Johnson, Matejchuk, etc., right? And I think the path to that becomes a little less clear if Lindstrom doesn't become either that top line winger or that second line center, right? Again, obviously you want the second line center, but if you have to settle for a top line winger, it's not the end of the world. But it does mean that they'll have to go somewhere else, right? Because again, Monahan's not going to be there forever. And looking at the Blue Jackets, prospect pool right now, I don't think they have another clear-cut, top six center option in there. I've just mentioned Luca Del Barbaluz. I think is going to be a very good middle six center, probably a 3C. Similarly with Luca Pinelli, actually, talking about the Lucas. He's also a center. I think he also has kind of probably a 3C that can play up the lineup if you need him to. But I think they don't have anyone who, obviously, the best case scenario for Cayden Lindstrom is that he becomes a 1C caliber player that has to play on the second line, right? Kind of similar to, and I'm not comparing the players, but very similar to with the Penguins when they had, peak Crosby and Malkin. Malkin would have been a 1C on many, many, many teams, but because he was playing behind Crosby, he played 2C minutes, and teams had to deal with Sidney Crosby, and then as soon as Sidney Crosby got off the ice, Evgeny Malkin comes on the ice and makes their job maybe just as hard, if slightly less hard, right? So that's the goal, right? Is that you want it to be Fantilli comes off the ice, Lindstrom comes on the ice, and you're like, oh, this is just another top line. This is just another top line forward. And I don't think there's anyone else on the prospects pool right now that has that level of has that ceiling, right? Pinelli, Del Barbaluz, they top out as second line centers, right? Lindstrom could be a 1C caliber that is going to have to end up playing behind Fantilli, right? I think that's the biggest plus in his corner right now, right? Is that there's really no one else in the prospect pool right now that has the potential that he does, right? And the prospect pool is in a bit of a weird place at the minute because obviously all of the Blue Jackets top end guys have started graduating. Fantilli, Johnson, Matejchuk, who I think you could arguably call Matejchuk a prospect. I probably wouldn't, and for the purposes of this episode, I'm not. But as these pieces start to graduate, the hope is that the prospect pool is going to get weaker because they're not continuing to add these top end guys because they're not drafting in the top 5, top 6, top 8 of the draft, right? They draft, what was their 14th overall this year? They should be drafting way lower next year if all things, if things go well, they should be drafting, my guess is between 16th and 20th overall, right? That's the hope anyway. And you're not going to get the same top end guys at 16th overall that you get at 4th overall, right? So in theory, Cayden Lindstrom should be the last high-end piece you are adding to this roster. if you want to continue to take steps forward. And so it's really, really important that Lindstrom reaches his potential, because the only way you're going to get another prospect of his potential and caliber is to go right back down and, draft fourth or fifth overall again. And I don't think anyone wants to see the Blue Jackets do that, right? Like we've done our losing. We've watched them lose. Now it's time for them to get better and better and better, right? And you're not going to add a prospect like Lindstrom at 16th overall, 17th overall, right? Like that's not how it works. So it's really important that Lindstrom hits, and hits big, because I don't think you're going to, if you are looking at prospects like Lindstrom in future drafts, then something has gone wrong, right? So that's my argument for Lindstrom being the most important prospect. However, there are a couple of other prospects I want to talk about that are potentially as important, but potentially not. So we're going to take a quick break, and then I'll talk about Jackson Smith and what this means for the defensive prospect pool. So we'll do that in just a second here on Locked On Blue Jackets. First, I've got to tell you about Game Time. We've all been there, logging on early, waiting forever for concert tickets to go on sale, only to lose your spot for a show you've been dying to see. Live music should be about making memories, not dealing with the stress of ticket shopping, and that's where Game Time comes in. They make getting concert tickets easier and faster than ever. Prices drop as it gets closer to showtime, and you can save up to 60% off with a killer last-minute deal. Their zone deals pick the best seats in your section for you, and the app will show you a panoramic seat view of the seat that you want to buy, so there are no surprises. And my favorite bit, there are no hidden fees. The price you see is the price you pay. Take the guesswork out of buying concert and show tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome back to Locked On Blue Jackets. We've talked about Cayden Lindstrom and how he is the most important prospect that the Blue Jackets have, but there's a couple of other guys that I want to talk about as well, in terms of importance that they hit, right? And I want to talk about Jackson Smith, who, again, continuing the trend of, like, hopefully the Blue Jackets will be drafting lower than 14th overall, right? So this might be the highest draft pick that they get in a while, right? Jackson Smith, 14th overall. I was really happy with this pick. I thought he would be gone by then. I had him going, probably to the Penguins at 10th or 11th. They didn't take him. Blue Jackets jumped. And there's your new top of the defensive prospect pool, right? Which was looking a little thin, which is wild because, and again, this is just kind of an example of how weird prospect pools are, because, like, look at the Islanders, for example. 2 years ago, they had the worst prospect pool in the league. This year, they are probably a top 5 or top 10 prospect pool because of the caliber that they added at the deadline, bringing in Cal Ritchie, and then at this draft, bringing in Aitchison, Eklund, and Schaefer with 3 top 15 picks, right? Or top 17 picks, excuse me. Things can change like that. The Blue Jackets a couple of years ago had a really, really strong defensive prospect pool, right? They had, obviously, Matejchuk was there. Jiricek, everyone was very high on. People were high on Kuhlmans, like Stanislav Svozil. I still think there's something there. Like, they had a pretty solid pool of defensive prospects. Jiricek gets traded. Matejchuk graduates. They've brought in pieces like Luca Morelli, who I'm quite high on. They've got, some other pieces that they're very excited about. Tanner Henricks is one of them. They've got they brought in Charlie Ellick via the draft. They brought in just a bunch of again, kind of like mid-range pieces for the most part, right? No one that projects as being a top-end defenseman, but guys that can definitely or should be able to play NHL minutes on, second or third pairing. Jackson Smith could be a top line defenseman, a top pairing defenseman for this team. He does play on the left side, which again continues to be kind of where the logjam of defensemen is for the Blue Jackets, which I think is why losing Jiricek hurts. We'll see what he turns into in Iowa. If he turns into anything, approaching a top 4 defenseman, that's going to suck for the Blue Jackets because they just don't have top caliber right defenseman in the prospect pool, right? But Jackson Smith comes in, is an excellent prospect. Again, is going with Lindstrom to the NCAA, playing at Penn State. Going to be playing with Gavin McKenna this upcoming season, so I'm sure that'll boost his numbers a little bit offensively. But he is, again, it's so tough to find good defensemen if you don't draft them and stick with them, right? Which is why I think it was frustrating that they gave up on Juracek as early as they did. But bringing in Smith, if you have in, again, 5 years' time, you've got a top four of, some combination of like Werenski, Matejchuk, Smith, someone else. Like if that's, or not a top four necessarily, but like if that's your left defenseman down that side, I feel pretty good about that, right? The reason I think Smith is less important than Lindstrom is that I think it's easier to find left defensemen than it is to find genuine top caliber centers. That doesn't make him not important, but I think it makes him less important than Lindstrom, right? Like, hopefully, again, the hope is that he still turns into the player that they think he's going to turn into. Excellent skater, very good defensively, very good in his own zone. Like, again, potential top line or top pairing defenseman there. But the Blue Jackets have Denton Matejchuk, arguably in that same position. Like, Werenski's still in his prime. He's only 27, 28 years old. He's still probably got 4 years of being at this level before he starts to decline, right? But as Werenski starts to decline, the hope is that that's when Jackson Smith starts to come up, right? And they should be kind of meeting in the middle. Matejchuk's going to keep getting better. So Smith, while I don't think he's as important as Lindstrom, is still important because you have to kind of prospect work, in especially in the NHL, I feel like it's kind of cyclical, right? Like as you move guys out, you've got to move guys in. Similarly with Lindstrom, like as Monahan starts to decline, Lindstrom should start to move up, right? There's a world where in 3 or 4 years' time, Sean Monahan is the 3C on this team, right? Because Fantilli and Lindstrom have overtaken him. Similarly with Smith and Matejchuk, you want to see them overtaking Werenski in 3-4 years' time. The reason, again, I might, if Smith played on the right, I think it would be way closer to more important than Lindstrom, just because of how shallow the Blue Jackets are on the right and how deep they are on the left right now. But I still think he's a really important prospect, if only because you want a top 15 prospect to hit, right? If someone is picked in the, arguably you want your first round picks, all your first round picks to hit, but that's not going to happen, right? And I still don't really know, for me anyway, what the cutoff between like, if your 15th overall prospect hits, is that different to if your 16th overall prospect, sorry, if your 15th overall prospect misses, is that different to your 16th overall prospect missing, right? So, but I still think a top 15 prospect, you want them to hit, and Smith is hopefully going to be the last player that they take in the top 15 with their own pick for the next, at least the next few years, right? So knock on wood, just to, again, prevent any kind of jinxing there. But I still think Lindstrom more important than Smith. But it's close. Again, if Smith was a right shot defenseman, I might be tempted to say that he's more important than Lindstrom, just because the Blue Jackets don't have a high-end right defenseman, but they do have a high-end young center in Fantilli, right? So Smith, less important than Lindstrom, still pretty important. We're going to finish off with the last first-round pick of the last couple of years. We're going to talk about Pyotr Andreyanov. How important is he as a prospect? Is he, again, kind of one of the more important prospects for the Blue Jackets? Let's discuss that in just a second here on Locked On Blue Jackets. First, I've got to tell you about Monarch Money. Do you ever wish that managing your money felt easier? Well, with Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings, planning a big purchase, or, just trying to get a hold of your budget, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO. It gives you full visibility and control over your finances. And it's more than just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, your investments, and your spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth. I love having everything in one place. I don't like that I had to go to my banking app, then to a budgeting app, and then to a spreadsheet, and then back to my banking app. Like, I can do it all on Monarch, which is incredible and makes it so much easier. Do what I did. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNHL for 50% off your first year. Welcome back to Locked On Blue Jackets. We've talked about Lindstrom. We've talked about Smith as the most important prospects that the Blue Jackets have right now. We're going to talk about kind of a sleeper pick at the minute. And the reason I say this is, the Blue Jackets have a lot of goalie prospects. I don't think you can have too many goalie prospects because you never know which ones are going to hit, which ones are going to miss, when they're going to hit, right? Like, you should be taking a goalie every single draft because goalies are voodoo and no one understands them. Or, people claim they understand them. I don't buy it. No, I understand a little bit about goalies, again, just enough to make me dangerous, but the sense is that they view Andreyanov as the next big goalie in Columbus, right? Like, they've drafted a goalie in the last, I think, 4 straight drafts. They drafted Ivanov, they drafted Melvin Strahl, they drafted Evan Gardner, who's weirdly not on this list of Blue Jackets prospects, and they just recently drafted Pyotr Andreyanov. So, 4 goalie prospects. Why is Andreyanov the most important? Well, they took him with the highest pick. So, again, similarly to the Smith pick, it feels important that if you pick a goalie at 20th overall, it feels important that they hit, right? If you're confident enough in a goalie to take him in the first round, that goalie has got to be good, right? Like, I believe Yaroslav Askarov is the most recent first-round goalie pick to make the NHL. Sebastian Cossa and Jesper Wallstedt both went in the 2022 draft. Possibly the 2021 draft. It was whatever year the Sillinger draft was, which I think was 2021. But again, 2 first-round picks that have not yet made impact in the NHL, right? So it's going to be a project for Andreyanov, but it feels like there's a lot riding on this player, more so than, they took a goalie in the second round last year, which I was surprised by, in Evan Gardner. Evan Gardner seems like he's turning into a very good young goalie. But there's nothing wrong with kind of padding your goalie prospect pool and being like, well, one of these guys has got to hit, right? But Andreyanov feels like the guy that they really, really need to hit, Sergei Ivanov, I'm really high on. It sounds like he's coming over to North America at the end of next season, should be here for the 26-27 season. Andreyanov obviously is not going to be here until 2030. I know that people keep saying things about, well, maybe he'll come early and, like Michkov did, who I believe he got out of his contract 2 years early. And I know there's no official NHL clause in a KHL contract, but they can make it work if they want, right? But that's just, again, if you don't see him till 2030, that's just kind of how long goalies take. And I understand the frustration in a first round pick not making the NHL for 5 years. Sometimes it's just like that. I'd rather they be patient than rush him. We've seen what happens when you rush prospects. We've seen what happens when you rush goalies. I still think that Merzlikins could probably have benefited from some time in the AHL, or more time in the AHL than he accepted. Because I don't know that he was ready to go from the Swiss League to the NHL, right? Like, that's a big jump. The KHL to the NHL is a smaller jump. If Andreyanov gets significant KHL time over the next 4 or 5 years, which obviously we're hoping that he will. But to kind of my point here on, is he as important as Lindstrom or Smith? Not necessarily, just because I believe that the Blue Jackets have a lot of other goalie prospects that have potential, right? But once again, I go back to the thing I talked about with Lindstrom, which is it's so important to just kind of stumble upon. It's so hard to just kind of stumble upon a good goalie, right? You can't. It's hard to trade for a goalie. They're very rarely are they available in free agency. Very rarely are they available in trade. Like, you have to draft them, and you have to spend your time on them, and you have to develop them, right? I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, that, all the other options, but drafting a goalie, developing him, walking him to the NHL yourselves, I think is that's the most surefire way to know what you're getting. And again, it's really important that if you have a goalie prospect that you like, that he hits, because it's look at the Blue Jackets the last handful of years, right? No disrespect to the Blue Jackets, to the goaltenders that they've had, but they've all had their problems, right? The Blue Jackets haven't really had a difference maker in goal probably since Bobrovsky left, right? They had Korpisalo and Merzlikins, then they had Merzlikins and Tarasov, and then they had, and now it looks like they're going to have Merzlikins and Greaves, or Greaves and Merzlikins, whichever way you want to order it. If you have the next Bobrovsky, that's important, right? And obviously they don't know that they have the next Bobrovsky. Goalie development is kind of a mystery to many, many, many people. It's going to be really interesting to see what comes of Andreyanov. Again, I don't think he's as important as Lindstrom. I don't know that he's as important as Smith, but it's really, really important to have high-end goalie prospects basically cycling through the system. And especially because the worst case scenario, the worst case scenario is that you have all of your goalie prospects bust, right? If the second worst scenario is that all of your prospects hit and you have too many of them, you get to trade those prospects for futures, right? If, for example, Jet Graves turns into the second coming of Dominik Hasek and, has a .945 save percentage for the entirety of his career, which is not going to happen, but, then as guys like Ivanov become NHL ready, then that's an asset that you can move. If Gardner becomes NHL ready, that's an asset you can move, right? Goalies are cyclic, just prospects in general. You move one in, you move one out, you move one in, you move one out. The hope is that Andreyanov is going to be the next big piece to move in. If that's in 5 years, fine. But the timeline and the fact that the Blue Jackets have so many pieces in goal is why I'm not putting Andreyanov above Lindstrom or Smith. I still think Lindstrom is the most important prospect because, again, that's a 4th overall pick. If the guy that got drafted immediately behind him, Ivan Demidov, becomes the player that, Habs fans think that he's going to, Lindstrom has to hit. Otherwise, we're never going to hear the end of it. And also, watching someone that that was drafted with 1 pick later is going to suck, right? That's just how it goes, right? So Lindstrom is the most important. I am cautiously optimistic about NCAA Lindstrom. I think that's going to be really fun. I think it's the best place for him. So we'll see how it goes. Again, I think it should be fun. He's definitely going to be the guy that I'm going to be trying to watch the most of in terms of prospects this season. And hopefully what we're going to see is more steps forward to him being the player that he looked like he was going to be in his draft year. So, but again, we're not going to see him for a couple of years, probably. Give him 2 years in college, have him come over at the end of the 26-27 season for the playoffs or whatever, and go from there. But Lindstrom, most important prospect. We're going to keep our prospect talk going. We're going to talk about prospect again in tomorrow's episode. I think we're going to take a look at the draft with a draft expert, and if the scheduling works out anyway, and then we'll go into our top 25 under 25 Blue Jackets players, because that I think is going to be a lot of fun. So keep an eye out, and we'll be sending out or tweeting out a poll or a ranking or something along those lines for Blue Jackets players under the age of 25. So keep your eyes out for that. I'm on Blue Sky at JAKOBFORSTER. The podcast is LO-Blue Jackets on Blue Sky and LO_Blue Jackets on Twitter. And if you have comments, questions, criticisms, email me at lockedonbluejackets@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. We'll be back tomorrow with more prospect talk. And until then, make sure you stay locked on.